We made this! Hello and welcome to another edition of Pick a Disc. I'm your host Matt Latham, and this is the podcast where someone picks a disc to talk about for whatever reason they want to. Today, the guest I'm welcoming onto the podcast is Lance from the Yesterday's Concerts podcast, and he's going to be talking about King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard and their album Infest the Rat's Nest. So yeah, as naturally we do, we talk about the album, we talk about the songs, talk about the band, blah, 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 blah. Quite a lot of interesting conversation about the band themselves because of just what exactly they do in terms of when they release albums, and they release albums, quite a lot of them. Yeah, quite a lot. I'm pretty sure on I think this is coming out in October, and this month they'll be releasing 5 albums, I think, just in this month alone, October 2022. So if you like what you hear and want to hear more, feel free to subscribe on your favourite podcast apps of choice. And if you want to follow me on Instagram, Facebook or Twitter, just click on the search bar and type in Pick a Disc. It's gonna be me. So yeah, don't forget also there's the Discord link in the show notes. So yeah, that is the introduction done, so there's nothing left to do, but let's talk to Lance. Okay, so, I mean, this is another, and I apologise for everyone listening to this because it's an audio medium, but this is another case of what's in the background of my guest, and I've got a couple of questions, but I don't know whether one of them might quickly might spoil who we're talking about in a second, but I know you got a Who poster in the background.
That is a Who poster from their most recent US tour. Yeah. There's a Dead and Company poster in the middle, and then there is a Fish poster from their Nashville show in 2021. It's in the art of our guest or of our artist today, actually, but it is not of our artist. It's just Fish. Ah,
okay, yeah, because I definitely could tell the Who, but I couldn't see. Oh, hang on, yeah, I can see the name Fish now, yeah, but I couldn't see the middle one. But yeah, that's going to make perfect podcasting audio medium. But
yep.
But yeah, this is So Lance from the Yesterday's Concerts podcast is my guest for this episode of the podcast, and I'm gonna let you introduce the album in a bit minutes, because I'm going to apologise now, because every time I've tried to practice saying the names, my tendency to get things mixed up keeps getting in. So I've been trying to get these in the right order. Why not set the precedent of how they're supposed to be pronounced, how they are the name in the correct order? Lance, why don't you tell the listeners the disc that you picked for today?
I have picked the album, the 2019 album, Infest the Rat's Nest by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. So for our purposes, let's just call him King Gizzard, or even King Giz. Let's keep it as short as possible.
King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. For ages, because when I was doing kind of mic test before we started recording, before the call started, I was there going, King Wizard, no. And it's a tongue twister.
It is.
Name. Yeah. So the Infest the Rat's Nest, which is the first. Oh, okay. I had the number of the album.
It's their 15th, I believe.
In a tab. 15th. I knew it was quite high.
Yep.
And we're going to get into kind of that high number at some point in the...
We will. It's unavoidable.
In the discussion of this. But released in 16th of August 2019. And it's... Now, before we start talking about the album itself in general, let's just get into your history with the band.
Okay.
So, when did you first hear of King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard?
You got it, man. You nailed it. Crushed it. Way to go. Yeah. Off to a good start.
Yeah.
Probably 2015 or 2016 was the first time I heard about them. I think they formed in 2012. And I believe it was Trey Anastasio, the Fish guitarist, was referencing how much he enjoyed them and how much he'd liked them. And that I may be misquoting that one. I may be thinking of somebody else, but somebody recommended them as a big name artist. And so I just got on Spotify, saw by that point they had like 10 albums. So I just saw, hey, this artwork's cool. I'll listen to this one. And it was their 12 Bar Bruise album, which is not a great introductory album for a King Gizzard fan. I'll just throw that out there now. It's pretty lo-fi. The band's still trying to find their sound. I didn't love it. So eventually in 2019, I came back to the band because this album, Infest the Rat's Nest, was gaining some traction. And I heard a lot of buzz about it. And I said, I want to come back and check it out. Listen to it. Didn't love it. at the time, and then kind of ended up diving through the band. And over the pandemic is really when I had a lot of free time and just started diving into their catalog, and discovered just the richness of their catalog and the difference in albums and what they can really bring to the table. So that's kind of my background with the band and how I just kind of came to love them over time. It's been a long journey.
So it was a band member from Fish that kind of just referenced them randomly.
Yeah, I think it was an interview. It was an interview with Trey. I believe it was Trey Anastasia that was talking about how much he loved them and found inspiration in what they were doing, and then it was inspiring how he was playing guitar that summer tour. And as a Fish fan, I was like, well, if Trey said it, it's got to be great. I got to go check it out. And so Trey was wrong that time in my book, but I eventually came around and realized that Trey was very right.
The debut album, that was 12 Bar Bruises. That's the one you first started with.
That was my debut with them. That was not their first debut album. They've had a couple releases before that one. But yeah, it's especially some EPs and things like that. But yeah, that was the first one that I listened to. It's a very lo-fi album. It's a very garage rock kind of album. They haven't really found the King Giz sound that people have come to know and love from them. They're still kind of in like an OCs kind of phase. They're kind of trying to figure out, are we a punk band? Are we a garage band? Are we a rock band? What are we? And there's still some stellar tracks on that album, but overall, it's an album you can't really appreciate until you really dove into the band and kind of figured out who they are and you understand the lore around.
So what was it about when this album came out that made you decide to like, okay, let's do this one, let's try them again? Was it just...
Yeah, I'm a thrash metal fan. Like Megadeth is one of the bands that I really latched onto when I was a teenager. And so I love Slayer, I love Metallica, the big four really. And so when people were talking about, this new thrash album is out, I was like, well, I got to go check it out. And so that's, it was gaining a lot of buzz because it is pretty different from the rest of the band's catalog. I mean, to put a blanket statement on King Giz is to say that they are a psychedelic rock band. And so for them to be putting out a thrash metal album is, it's kind of interesting. So that's one of the reasons I went and checked it out. And I eventually, like I said, I didn't love it on the first listen. I appreciated the metal, but I didn't get it. And so that's when I started going back, checked out Notagon Infinity, Polywagaland. I can't pronounce, that's the one I can't pronounce. And several of their other albums, I'm in Your Mind, Fuzz. Those were the albums that really helped me connect and start to understand the band. And then I was able to come back to Infest the Rat's Nest and say, oh my gosh, what a fantastic album this is.
So I think King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, or King Giz, they're a name that I've known for. I know the name. Mm-hmm. The name's familiar for like years and years and years, and I think that they tour quite a lot, and I think they do tour the UK quite a lot as well, and they're quite prominent in the festival scene as well. So their name always seems to pop up in certain kind of like psychedelic rock festivals mainly as well, and they occasionally get crossed over and get referenced in kind of like magazines or websites that are kind of my kind of music, which is kind of more like indie or indie pop type stuff. And sometimes they venture out and kind of like creep into that kind of sphere. But yeah, so but I never really listened to them. I just assumed there was kind of like a psychedelic rock band. As you said, they were. So, and I don't think I ever listened to them properly. So when I first opened up Infest the Rat's Nest, I was like, this is not a band I would. This is not the sound that I was expecting from King Gizzard, the Lizard Wizard. And then I think just like a few hours earlier today, I was looking through some of the lyrics on Genius and the comment section for the Planet B,
yeah,
which I'm assuming it was their first single. It's just a bunch of people going, "What the hell? What?" And just a bunch of people like King Giz fans going, "What the hell is what? This is great." Or some people that's confused. And I'm like, okay, there's a lot of very surprised people. And then I went to listen to the first. And then like about half an hour before we start recording, I was like, played the first song from Fishing for Fishies. And I was like, wait, what? What? I would not assume that this was the same band, because Fishing for Fishies sounds something like almost kind of jaunty folk. Kind of like almost like Noah and the Whale mixed in with a bit of I can't think of any side rock bands at the moment because it's not my genre. But yeah, and it was like I don't know. It's just like it feels like, oh, let's do a kind of Motorhead style
Yes.
band
Yeah.
album for once and stuff. Yeah, so I mean, so I'm yeah, the impact on the kind of fan base must have been quite interesting when it first happened.
Yeah, it's crazy too when you look at just the amount of albums they released, because like we were saying, this is their 15th album, and they didn't release any albums in 2018, but in 2017 they released 5 albums. And so I mean 5 albums in 1 year, and then again in 2022 this year they're going to release 5 albums, which is only one less than Radiohead has released since 2000, which is just bonkers. But when you look at 2019, the 2 albums, Fishing for Fishies and Infest the Rat's Nest, are both conservationalist, environmentalist album in concept. But however, the way they tell the stories, and I'm probably jumping ahead in the questions, the way they tell the stories is uniquely different. And it's pretty amazing considering the band shows just the breadth of ability within them, that they can do Fishing for Fishies, which is this really happy, upbeat, fun, and kind of silly, childish almost. And then you have Infest the Rat's Nest, which is thrash metal, Slayer, Motorhead, all these things, but they're telling the same story at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think that kind of productivity from the band's interesting. I think we'll probably talk a bit more about that in a second. For those who don't know, King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard are an Australian rock band formed in 2010 in Melbourne, Victoria. Band's current lineup consists of Stu McKenzie, Ambrose Kenny Smith, Cook Craig, Joey Walker, Lucas Harwood, and Michael Kavanagh. And they are known for exploring multiple genres, staging endless live shows, and building a prolific discography, having released 20 studio albums, 10 live albums, 2 compilations, and 3 EPs in 12 years. Just to put that, in 12 years.
No big deal.
Yeah, so that is more than, as you said, there's 1 year where they released 5, and they're releasing 5 this year. So they've kind of dipped in all sorts of different genres. Their Wikipedia page has psychedelic rock, garage rock, acid rock, progressive rock, psychedelic pop, neo psychedelica, and heavy metal.
And I think you're missing, like, they've done a jazz album. Like, it's not outright jazz, but they've done a jazz album. They've done a Western folk inspired album as well. So I mean, like, they've even, on their most recent album that's been released, they even dipped into hip hop. So I mean, like, they really haven't not covered anything at this point almost.
Yeah. So I'm not read too much into the band themselves, but I'm getting the impression that they're just someone who just seems to want to try everything and just see what sticks.
I think it's just their love of music and their love of being in the studio and playing together. I think that's really the magic of this band, is that they are such music fanatics. There's a great video, Amoeba Records, out in California somewhere, does a great video series of What's in My Bag. And it's basically, they bring bands into the store, let them shop around, and then they sit them down on a couch and get them to go over what they purchased. And they're just pulling out all these very obscure records. And just like that, one of them was Herbie Mann Explores Middle Eastern Music. And it's just like, who buys that other than just like a very fascinated music fan? Like, your average Joe isn't going to go listen to that album. And even like the Stu McKenzie, the lead singer, was like, he didn't buy any records. He bought like a book of like satanic stories. And he was just like, yeah, I'm sure these will work their way into a song at some point. So, I mean, it's just, that's just the breadth of what they're coming from. I just think it tells to how big of music fanatics they are in and of themselves.
I wonder how much of it as well is kind of the challenge of trying to do something of a different genre and keeping things interesting. Like, they've probably got a dartboard of like genres throwing at it and going, okay, our next album is going to be 12th century monk chanting. Okay, let's do it.
And I have no doubt that they would bring a great monk album to the world for us to enjoy. Like, they could do it, and it wouldn't surprise me if that's album number 30 or 31.
Yeah, I mean, that's, again, I think it's just amazing about how much they've covered. On the flip side, though, it does begin to fall into a kind of trap, I find, with kind of older artists that I've tried to get into in the past, in that the bigger the discography, the more intimidating it is to get into bands and stuff. And I think perhaps one of the reasons I kind of elected to kind of do this podcast in general is like basically outsourcing the more popular bands that I've not listened to.
Yeah.
um,
It's very Frank
So,
Zappa-esque almost. Like, I mean, there's only a handful of Frank Zappa albums that I can find accessible just because his discography is too huge. I don't know where to get, they make these great flow charts on all the different places online. Like, if you like this album, go listen to this one next. And, with a band like this, they're at they're going to be at like album 22 by the end of the year or something, 23. And it's like, if I'm a new fan, where do you even start with that? Like, how do you get into this band knowing that they have 3 more albums coming out in October? They've already announced that they're working on albums 24 and 25, which will likely come out next year. How do you even get into them? And they're still a modern band touring, putting out albums every year. It's such a hurdle, and but it's awesome at the same time.
Yeah, and I mean, like, there are probably some of the most famous acts ever made probably haven't got as many albums as they have, and they still have daunting.
Yeah, exactly.
Daunting things and stuff. That's a question. I wonder which artist has had the most albums ever made or released the most albums.
That's a good question.
Wonder who that is.
That's a really good question.
You know what? Actually, yeah. No, you know what? I think I'm going to Google.
I was about to say, we got the world's knowledge at our fingertips. Let's figure this out.
Yes. Yeah. When a live, I don't know how entertaining this is to the listener, but
I wonder if it's like
let's do a live Google.
Is it like Buckethead or somebody or like a jazz artist that just pumps them out?
Which artist has the most albums sold? No, not that one. I want the most albums released. Let's have a look. It's probably going to be someone who's like had a.
I know there's a way to like game the Spotify algorithm now to get more listens based on like how many releases you have. So I hope it's not something like that, because that would be lame.
Yeah, I think it's not plays. I think it's the more actual releases.
Yeah.
Well, I can't find a list that's on there. But apparently, according to Wikipedia, Viper has released over 1,000 albums as of 2019.
Whoa.
The rapper Viper I've not heard of.
1,000 albums. Wow. That's it's pretty hard to find a good starting point there. I guess that's going back to your dartboard.
Yeah. As of July 17, 2020, Viper has released over 1,927 albums.
Oh my gosh.
However, a vast majority of releases contain songs that have been chopped and screwed, slowed down, simply recycled, or put under different names with no change of their content. That therefore only. Okay, so apparently Wikipedia says that the list is a lot smaller, a lot smaller than that. But that's a very interesting question. I mean, it's probably, and there's another blog which Wikipedia only seems to have the most top 10 albums, but very hard to know definitely who's released the most albums of all time. But Gregory Isaacs is to be very close. He was a Jamaican reggae artist who released his first album in 1975. And by the time of his death in 2010, there was 120 individual albums. So this number doesn't include compilations. If you include compilations, there are 500.
That feels like a winner. Because I'm sure with Viper, like if he's chopping and screwing, then that's a comp album. That's a remix album. That doesn't count. So
yeah. But apparently there's a site which has Frank Zappa has released 119.
Oh gosh.
Apparently.
That doesn't surprise me.
Yeah. But yeah, I think that's actual physical albums. I mean, if there's anyone listening who probably might know where to look at least.
Yeah.
Because I'll be interested to see like a chart of how many albums people have released. Please feel free to send me something.
Yeah.
Because I'll be very interested. I'm quite interested into seeing that. But so so they've still got quite a way to go.
Yes, they got to get back in the studio. They're kind of slacking.
Yeah, they're not as productive as we thought.
Come on, King Giz.
Yeah. I mean, you've only got another 100. Another 100. You can probably get that done. You can probably do that in the next few weeks. But I mean, that's quite. I mean, that said though, that should mean that there's at least something for everyone.
Yeah.
In this.
Theoretically, yeah.
So I think the Infest, the Rat's Nest might not. So I say I'm not much of a thrash metal fan, so I'm not to listen to kind of like either Metallica
Yep.
or said Slayer or anything like that. It's not really kind of my genre. But then I think from what I listen to, Fishing for Fishies might sound a lot more kind
Yes.
of it's a lot more kind of like my kind
Yeah.
of indie pop-esque kind of stuff.
And you might really like Butterfly 3000, which is like a synth pop kind of indie stuff. There's nothing really heavy to it at all. It came out, gosh, what did it came out earlier this year or late last year? I'm blanking. It's a fairly recent release.
Butterfly 3000, 2021.
Yep. So
I've got the discography here.
Yeah, it's a really pop synthy based. It's a really great album. Just to I listen to it a lot after listening to Infest the Rat's Nest, just to kind of like refresh my palate from all the metal and the bleakness of the album lyrics. But yeah, you might like that one. That one might be a good starting place for you.
Ah, okay. Might do that one. Jumping ahead to the
Yes,
other album
sorry.
question. Very way ahead of it. But no, but again, this is perhaps an artist where you can't really talk about without discussing how they approach albums because of how prolific they are. As I said, they will release multiple ones in multiple years. But we are talking about Infest the Rat's Nest, and the album itself in general. The album itself is almost very concepty. So we've got very concepty, and I started starting to skim like the surface level of some of the subjects and a mythology that's almost starting to develop through the kind of the King Gizzard kind of discography. The closest analog I could think of, perhaps not as meta, is the Coheed and Cambria that I covered last year. Either last year or the year before, with Steve from Play Pods Right. There's like a kind of fictional ongoing narrative that's happening throughout the whole of it. I don't know if that's apparent through every King Gizzard album, but from what I've gathered, there's a kind of mythology that's formed.
Yes, it's called the Gizverse. I'm not the scholar of the Gizverse that I should be to call them my favorite band. But there is a Gizverse that you can research and find out all about how all of the albums are connected in some way. It's this kind of sci-fi element of how they're all connected. A lot of like the album Murder of the Universe really has a big, strong hand in telling that story. Infest the Rat's Nest comes into that. There's an album that came out earlier this year called Made in Timeland that has a pretty big part in that. So there's a Gizverse attached. I think, speaking specifically about Infest the Rat's Nest, this is a concept album of telling a story, that kind of starts off with an element of truth and reality that we find ourselves every day in. And then that's pretty much side A. And then side B actually goes into the more sci-fi environmental epic, that's a little bit that we haven't got to yet. It's not outside of the realm of possibility, sadly. But it is definitely a story contained within itself.
Yeah. From what I gathered, there's kind of like multiple characters. I think one of I found an article about the kind of like a brief introduction to the Gizverse, where apparently there's a well-known character. Is it called Han?
I don't know how to pronounce it, but he's a robot. He's a robot that he comes up on. I think it's Murder of the Universe is his first appearance. I could be, somebody will prove me wrong, but I believe that's his first appearance.
So and apparently all the humans now become digital beings. Apparently, from what I've gathered, and again starts to gets slightly more complex, and without kind of getting too much into it. Yeah, I think it's a lot, very kind of in depth.
Yes.
But then from here as well is that there are like kind of more contemporary stories, and songs which are separate, like either standalone or separate from these concepts. So, for example, this like article says that they tell stories of gamblers, cowboys, Australian rules, footballers, people vultures, Balrogs, lightning gods, flesh-eating beasts, sages, and spacefaring eco rebels. And each of these tales the band contends takes place in a universe of its own, yet the band maintains all such universes are parallel. These stories are connected and coexist in a meaningful way. Furthermore, the band has already decided, or so they claim, how the story ends. They have planned what their final album, hopefully arriving many years from now, will be. So it's kind of almost like an MCU multiverse.
That's exactly the greatest comparison you can make for it. Yeah, it's definitely, and I mean, and it's one of those that, like, you know, I think about what's the Gorillas, not the Gorillas, but Gorillas. They apparently have their own kind of multiverse kind of thing going on. That's a story that runs through all of their albums. You know, I like the Gorillas, but I don't really understand the story. I don't listen. I mean, and that's something I should be pretty forthright about. Is I'm not a lyrics guy. I really don't listen to lyrics most of the time. Most of the time, I view the singer and the voice that's being projected as just another instrument in the mix. You know, if lyrics are outlandish enough that they distract me from the music, then that's typically when I say, oh, these are bad lyrics. Otherwise, to me, it's just the melody that's coming through the artist singing or whatever. So for me to notice that there's a story happening within the Gizverse, you know, especially on the Rat's Nest album, that's significant to me because it caught my eye, or caught my ear, I guess, that there's something much bigger at play here, that this is something worth noting. You know, and I mean, a lot of it is just, it's so bleak and dystopian on the Rat's Nest album that it did catch my ear. And that's when I really went and started reading what is the story that's being shared on the Rat's Nest album.
Yeah, and for the and the story, I think, for the album itself is that it talks about kind of like an ecological disaster.
Yes.
Which I think then basically means that they go to Venus to try and survive. Is that?
So I actually,
very, very
Matt, I got to be honest, I came prepared. I wrote a synopsis. Can I read it for you? I did my homework.
Oh, please do.
Okay, so
please do.
I'm gonna try to be dramatic with this. I'm gonna try to yesterday's concert this a little bit. So Infest the Rat's Nest plot begins on Earth in the not so distant future. Climate change has rendered the planet almost inhabitable, and so the rich population has fled to Mars to terraform it. Unable to afford the steep price of a ticket to Mars, most of Earth's poorer population have been left on the planet. Things come to a head when a superbug breaks out and humanity is forced to its last hope, Venus. Their first spaceship, Venusian 1, explodes before it manages to land on the planet, but its successor, Venusian 2, lands successfully on the planet's surface. Upon exiting Venusian 2, the humans find themselves on a literal hellscape, and many kill themselves by self-immolation. They awake in a hell and are greeted by Satan, who recruits them into the army of the damned, and he instructs them to begin the invasion of the Rat's Nest, also known as Mars. So, talk about bleak and just quite out there.
Yeah, it's quite dark,
Yes.
but science fiction.
Yeah.
But
and that's what, and like,
yeah,
the Venetian story is really like when they start going to Venus is side 2 of the album, whereas side A is more about the superbug and, you know, environmental things like that, which, you know, I don't think you have to be into the story to say like, hey, our climate change is real. Like there's climate change stuff happening all around us. Like that in and of itself is pretty scary, like really and truly.
I think there's not one for subtlety. Not one for subtlety either in the album.
No.
I mean, like, it opens up with "There is no planet B," which
yeah,
is very kind of in your face.
Well, and so like when I was listening to this album in preparation for our talk, I got to thinking about my tattoo artist. She's a big horror fan, and I'm a big scaredy cat. Like I don't do horror movies at all. And when
that's
I get scared just watching like Stranger Things. I mean, it's ridiculous. But she was telling me, I was like, "What do you like about it?" And she was like, "I love how horror films can tell stories that regular movies can't tell. That they tell stories that are much darker and just bleaker in a lot of ways, or even like more metaphorically, without, you know, just the way that like a drama could or something like that. That they tell these rich stories that are often overlooked because you're too focused on being scared, quite frankly." And I think that's what I've come to love about this album, is that like it's a heavy metal album for a reason, because so many people associate heavy metal with horror in terms of music, that they're using heavy metal to tell this bleak story about where the earth is and where we're headed. And to me, that's brilliant. I mean, especially when you compare it against Fishing for Fishies, where you have this, you know, they're also using sarcasm to tell this bleak story. And so, I mean, that just, to me, that's incredible. I love it. Like, they're so tapped into that. It's great.
Yeah, I think the added kind of, I think, shock value of using the thrash metal genre, which again, I'm assuming this is the first time they delve into that kind of heavy.
So it is and it isn't. So there's a couple of songs like Great Chain of Being that came out of Gumboot Soup. There's Road Train on Nonagon Infinity, Doom City, which is on Flying Microtonal Banana, and then the Murder of the Universe album. Those are all kind of early dances with metal that the band kind of explored. So when Rat's Nest came out, everyone was like, yes, finally. Like, we knew they had it in them. They toyed with it. They kind of teased us that they could do it. So for them to come out with a full album of thrash metal, everyone was pretty excited about that, just because like they teased them for so long that they could do it. And then there's a whole album, excellent album of it.
And I'm assuming as well that I think because of who the band are, then I'm assuming that even the dedicated fan base, right, will probably say if they don't like an album, they'll just go, well, I'm just gonna go to sleep.
Yeah, exactly,
tomorrow.
Exactly.
So I'm assuming that like at least like the fans will know that at least okay, they're not gonna like every album.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny too,
so,
because so many like Giz heads are fairly remiss to say they even have a bad album. Like Eyes Like the Sky is probably the only album that's kind of universally panned. And it's one of the early albums. It's one of their first attempts at a concept album. And that's the Western folk kind of album. It works, but it doesn't work. It's one of those that like once you get into the band and start appreciating them, then you'll appreciate the album with a little bit more. But Infest the Rat's Nest is typically in top 5 for most Giz heads. Like it's pretty uncommon for it not to be in a top 5. And, and that I'm not speaking for all of them, but that seems to be the general consensus that it is a top 5 Giz album.
Oh, okay. Before we perhaps delve into the songs, so where would King Gizzard rank in kind of your favorite bands of all time?
Right now, they are my number one, hands down. They have been slowly creeping into that spot without me realizing it, and it was probably earlier this year or later last year that I kind of was like, oh, they are my favorite band. I pay more attention to them than anyone else. I read more about them. I listen to them more. I think the reason, and I'm going to make a pretty bold statement, I think they are the most interesting band, not just on the scene right now, but in musical history. That's a pretty bold statement considering how many incredible legendary artists we have and have seen. And I'm not knocking them, but the sheer production value that they put out every year, mixed with just their ability to do all the different genres so well. It's just fascinating to me. Like even before I started really diving into their music and claiming them as my favorite band, I found them as the most interesting band just because of the level of engagement they have with their fans. I mean, they started, what was it, in 2020, I believe they started a bootleg program where they put out albums, like live albums, demo albums, things like that. And they say, here you go, do whatever you want with it. If you want to press it onto vinyl, press it onto vinyl. If you want to make cassette tapes, put it on cassette tapes and just sell it. Just send us a few so that we can sell them in our store as well. And they did that for their fans. I mean, there's not many other bands outside of the jam band world that are doing anything similar to that. And, to me, they are the most fascinating band, especially when you start reading about the lore and the Gizverse and things like that. That's just, there's not a lot of other bands doing anything quite on that level.
Yeah, I can't think of anything top of my head as well. But again, yeah, it's just the amount of stuff they're churning out. It seems to be a group of people who are just fascinated about music, all kinds of music, or just bringing it through and stuff.
Yeah.
But so let's move on to the songs themselves. So, which songs perhaps you want to start talking about first?
I don't think you can start without starting with the first track, Planet B. I think Planet B is just such a gripping tune with such a stark reality to it. I mean, like you said, it starts off with "There is no Planet B." I mean, that to me, that's like, I was a journalism major and, that's your lead right there. That's the first thing that's going to really pop out and tell the news story for you. And it just sets this precedent for what the album's going to be that, I don't know. It's just such a great song. And, to tell such a harrowing story in such a fun way. I mean, that's the thing too about like, before I really started diving into the story behind the album, it's a fun album. Like, I mean, I work out to it. I like when I've had a bad day, I listen to it. It gets my anger out. it's it's just fun, like metal. Like they make metal fun on this album, whereas a lot of metal bands today are so hell bent, pun intended, on just being, evil and dark and over the top and the evil. And it's like, they're just making metal fun again. Like it's just such a great way to start the album. And they do it with such a way that it brings in, like their unique Gizzard sound, like their psych rock sound that they're known for on like Nonagon Infinity and things like that. You pick up the traces of it through it and they intertwine so well. It's just, can't start any better than that. Great start.
Yeah, it's the kind of like driving kind of drums immediately reminded me of Muzzin.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just like that kind of aggressive impact, like statement for the album. So like, this is what the album's going to sound like. It's going to be this trajectory.
And it's funny you keep mentioning Motorhead, because in that Amoeba video I was talking about earlier, the drummer Cavs, one of his albums that he pulled out was a Motorhead album. And he was talking about how the drummer, and I may be wrong quoting here, but he was talking about how the drummer was doing the double kick drum, and how that was one of the first major double kick drums to like get recorded or be like on a big album or something like that. And just what an inspiration that was to him. And he was just going on and on about how much he loved the double kick drum on that album. So, I mean, and I think that video came out in 2017. So, and they've said publicly that they work on albums for roughly 2 years at a time. So you have to assume that Motorhead album significantly like inspired Planet B. I mean, you just have to make that comparison or that, association.
And again, I think it's because of the more kind of aggressive kind of, particularly as this album goes on and they start throwing in the more kind of like dystopian elements to it. They kind of need to make their point heard. So that's what I think that's a key point in why they went towards the kind of thrash metal genre, is to make that kind of like, the planet's dying. And again, I mean, it's a play on words, and it's very unsubtle. It's as subtle as a house brick.
Yeah.
There is no planet B. Open up your eyes and see. And again, particularly quite relevant today as well, with the kind of climate emergency that's been announced and everything. It's kind of like their kind of intent. Okay, we're gonna make it. We're gonna incorporate all these kind of science fiction stuff. Outlandish concepts, but it's because of this very real thing that you can relate to that you need to take a quite interesting, basically, to save the planet. But we're also going to do it while headbanging. So again, I think some of the lyrics on here as well, setting stage for the actual narrative that's going to happen. Only way through is colonization, acclimatization, population exodus. Monetization, civilization, the operation has begun, there is no planet B, where, again, there's no plan B, but they kind of improvise, and that leads to the inevitable kind of quest to Venus. So, like, I think even today, I'm pretty sure there have been, like, either, I can't remember, so don't quote me this properly, but I do remember kind of reading something or hearing something about the fact that they have been looking into terraforming techniques. I think particularly with Mars and stuff, for Mars. And again, that's like stuff that's like referenced here.
Well, and you talking about that, I'm going to jump around a little bit, but like the song Superbug, like this came out in 2019, and we didn't know what was on the horizon for 2020 when this album came out. And then you have the song Superbug, which is talking about this virus that basically kills off the planet. And, then we have COVID-19 come into the play, and it's like, oh, hey, they were kind of right about that. And so, looking at Planet B and even going into the next song, Mars for the Rich, like they're kind of nailing it, especially since this was 3 years ago now. And like you were saying, they're looking at terraforming ways to do Mars. So, I mean, it's clearly like the dystopian reality is here, sadly.
There isn't a song about the owner of a multi-billion kind of online shopping empire, like going to space, is that?
I mean,
there isn't a song.
Yeah, I mean, it's just
like, or at least.
Yeah, I mean, that may be on their next album too. Who knows? But I mean, they're nailing it. Like, it's just Mars for the Rich. I mean, and they're so accurate in that, like, if we do have to leave Earth because the planet crisis becomes so real, it will be the poor left behind. And I don't mean to get political or conservationist or whatever we dance with, but like I just think the reality of side A is so strong and scary that again, it goes back to the horror aspects of like, you have to do this through metal. You have to do this through something heavier. Because if they did the fishing for fishies, you wouldn't grasp the severity of these lyrics. Like, and even like the
Yeah.
cadence that they use with the lyrics and how they like the metal cadence of his voice when he tells these lyrics just intensifies what he's actually saying.
Yeah, I think particularly with Superbug, I think we just jumped into that. The main annotation on Genius is quite interesting. Superbug is about a supreme killer illness that wipes out humanity in the near future. The song heavily references the antibiotic resistance phenomenon, which occurs when bacteria mutate into stronger strains resistant to drugs, becoming more likely to multiply and cause harm. The superbug of the song builds a high resistance to prescription drugs and eventually leads to potential extinction of the human race, as there is no way to combat the disease. In an unsettling and unintentional way, Superbug became a harrowing prediction of the COVID-19 pandemic. When making a post cancelling their April-May tours due to the virus, the band directly linked an upload to this song. So yeah, so
They called it.
links to COVID. Yeah.
And that's the scary thing too about like when you see, like when you hear Superbug coming, like sitting at home on lockdown from the pandemic, and you start hearing these things about like Earth is no longer inhabitable, so everyone leaves, or the rich leave and go to Mars, and you're left here on a dying planet. It's kind of scary because you realize like, oh, they nailed that part. They're nailing some of this other stuff, or at least it seems to be. It gets scary. I mean, like this is a true metal album in the sense of the horror.
Yeah, it's and again, I think perhaps dipping into the horror genre, or definitely at least the science fiction elements to this. But it again, it's kind of almost based on fact. Whereas facts where listening to this album in 2022, you're gonna have a slightly different reaction to it from listening to it in 2019 because of the COVID-19 pandemic, putting that into kind of into a more kind of like actual thing that could happen. And yeah, and like, as you said, look, you see all these kind of mutations for the kind of the coronavirus kind of mutations, like mutating around to try and survive and stuff. And it's that kind of thing can happen and has seen to happen.
Well, and it's funny you talking about that made me think about the Run the Jewels released their fourth album in summer 2020, and they have a song on there called Walking in the Snow that pretty graphically describes an African-American male being stopped by the police, and I don't remember the full story, but he gets stomped out and he can't breathe, and he sits there and he makes a pretty dramatic like struggling to breathe as he like says the lyrics. And everyone was like, how did you know when you wrote this song? And he's like, because that was when the giant civil unrest was happening in America, that several African-American men were killed. And one had his neck, stomped out by an officer who kept his knee on him, things like that. And it's, you see that he had no idea, but he was just also telling like, this is what I've seen in the past. So I'm sure it's going to happen again. And, to be able to tap into that as an artist and tell those stories is so important because, like you said, in retrospect, we give it a new lens. But I think even Neil Young has said something about like, the interpretation of the lyrics is whatever you make it to be. And that's the beauty of going back to music in retrospect, is finding your own interpretation and the way that it meets you in that spot. And so for things like that, that's huge for fans just to be able to connect in that way. And, I pray that we're not looking at some Venusian flight to get off Earth, because that would be kind of scary.
I would like to visit Mars though. I'm pretty sure that would be
cool. It would be very cool.
Yeah, I mean,
if I could be guaranteed
tourist reasons,
if I could be guaranteed safety to go to Venus and any of the planets, I'd sign me up. That'd be awesome. Like, that'd be a great tourist spot. Spend the summer on Mars.
Yeah. Where do you want to go to next in terms of the songs?
So we've covered Planet B, a little bit of Mars for the Rich, Superbug. I want to do Perihelion just because it's my favorite track on the album.
Okay.
I didn't know what it meant for a long time. I didn't know I thought they were just kind of making up words, but it's actually, I'm going to butcher this, but it's something to do with the relation of the planets into each other, the distance. There's like it's like perihelion is like the closeness, and then like arihelion or something like that is like a different version of it. So I didn't know that actually had anything to do with and it just furthers the sci-fi narrative to it. But the part to me that let's see, I have it written. The part to me is the bridge. The bridge is my favorite part of it. They kind of take a break from the metal and they go into this real melodic sounding thing. And the lyrics are, giver of life and giver of speed, ever we take, even her gravity, her glowing beauty is something to see, bigger and brighter, she cometh to me. I mean, that's just, to me, I don't know. Like, I'm not a lyrics guy, like I said, but that just snapped me. Like, and the bridge has always snapped me. And then when I read the lyrics, it gave it so much more meaning just to have the beauty of that behind it in the midst of all of this. Because I mean, even like in the context of the story, it's this scary thing happening, as I've said 1,000 times now. And then they're still in space admiring the beauty of the approaching planets. They're seeing all these things like we were just talking about, the tourist aspect of it. It has to be astounding. It has to be fascinating.
Yeah, I think they kind of use that perihelion kind of term. I think it's their kind of one chance, or that kind of act 2 part in the film, where say we have this one shot that we have to make to complete our goal, which is to, I think they're supposed to be slingshotting the vessels around the sun to try and get a boost towards Venus. And I think there's and I always think that the song kind of has a kind of musing about the sun and the sun in general and what it does. Like, for example, the giver of life and the giver of speed. The giver of speed is literally to do with the plot points of them trying to get enough speed to get to Venus in time. The giver of life is more kind of, again, literal factual thing of the sun is the reason we're here because of, and photosynthesis and stuff. But also, if the kind of maneuver works, then it helps them continue to help people survive. Quite like that kind of wordplay.
Yeah,
on that.
Yeah, it's great.
Quite clever done.
And I mean, I think just it also has the most catchy chorus of all the songs on there. I mean, it's an earworm of a chorus. I mean, the way they quote perihelion, it just gets into your head, and you kind of keep quoting it over and over. And that goes back to the thing I love about this band. It's just like, it's a metal album, but they give you this earworm with this incredibly catchy, incredible groovy, like lyrical cadence to the chorus. And that's kind of what's missing in a lot of metal today, is that it's so determined to be dark and angry and all these things that they're missing on all the things that made, songs like Master of Puppets like big, because it is catchy. It is got a groove to it. I mean, that's why Pantera was as big as they were, because it was metal music you could dance to, because it was just such a groove.
I think it's accessibility to a slightly general audience. I think so. If you got something that's easy to kind of catch on or latch onto, I don't want to say pop, but I've always made the argument that pop is a suffix for other genres, and I've always thought that pop is accessibility, not mainstream, but more accessibility to, like, not formulaic, but there's a catchiness to it, so that there's an ability for perhaps more people who probably aren't into that kind of music to be able to kind of catch on to it. So it's not kind of just straight noise. You've got that kind of pop sensibility to hook people in, or the earworm, as you said, to bring them in and stuff. And
it's the accessibility aspect of it. It's just that ability to open it up to a wider audience for something. That's like, I love the jam band Goose, and I was having a conversation with a friend the other day that most jam bands are not very accessible just on a general basis, because most people don't like 20-minute long songs, which is understandable. But the thing I love about Goose is, like, they have really great songs that are like, they're more indie based themselves than jam based in the sense of songwriting. And those songs are way more accessible for the common listener to say, like, hey, I really like this indie band that happens to jam. And so that, I think that's a huge ability in songwriting, to be able to kind of have that hook, to have that thing that makes a song accessible despite whatever backing genre they're playing to. I think that's a huge talent.
Yeah, and I think this one kind of does it as well, and manages to tell an interesting story and teach me some physics stuff at the same time. But apparently the opposite of the perihelion is the aphelion.
Aphelion, that's it.
Yeah, which is when it's the furthest point away from the
That's
sun.
it. Okay,
Yeah.
that's it. I knew it had something to
Yeah.
do with planet relation, like proximity. Okay, so that's it. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, again, the Genius page for this has a very nice diagram which points out what's the perihelion and the aphelion. Again, the rest of the kind of main thing is covers about with stuff that we've covered already. So, where do you want to move on to next?
So I want to do the last song, and this if you're good with it, this will be the last one I do. But I want to move on to the last song, which is Hell. This song is perhaps the heaviest on the album. It's definitely the darkest, and it's definitely leans into like the more fantasy sci-fi aspect of it. It's when they literally go to hell, like the people who were on Venusian 2 pass away from self-immolation. They come to hell, and Satan recruits them into the army of the damned, and he says, we're raiding Mars, let's go. The most bleak thing about it is they're emphasizing the circle of life, essentially. Like, even if we go to Mars, even if we colonize on Mars, we're going to ruin Mars too. And so they're kind of saying like, Satan's within his rights to kill us all because we're just ruining everything we come into contact with. And, you know, that stark reality of that final statement that they're pushing through that song, that's just such a powerful thing to me, like, to really bring it back to Planet B as well, of like, hey, this is our only shot. Like, let's not mess this up. Like, let's start getting our act together. But to have it in this kind of like wild fantasy, again, going back to the horror, like telling this story that you can't tell otherwise, I think it's just such a great metaphor or analogy, whatever the term is, to describe the story that they're telling.
Yeah, and just reading through the lyrics on Genius as well. Again, it's just like, yeah, it's the very kind of bleakest way to end this story. Yeah, so they're just saying, oh, okay, yeah, this is what's going to happen now. So,
yeah, there's no Darth Vader redemption arc in this story. Like, there's no, I mean, it's a very grim finish. And, you know, it would be nice to say like, hey, Earth gets it together and we turn into fishing for fishies. Like, that's how the album ends. It's on that note, but it doesn't. And again, going back to the conversation we had earlier, it's again, the forewarning that they're giving. It's scary. It's scary to think about, like, you know, what are we looking at if we really don't start viewing Planet A as our only option?
Yeah, and I think this what I quite like about this song as well is that it gives context to why the album is named the album, and because like they're going what rat's nest, and it turns out that, well, in this case it's Mars that's it's going to be, but it's because it's the humans that are it's the human race that are the rats, because the rat's nest is us and what we're doing. So he's just basically arming a bunch of rat exterminators.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, this is a great song for extermination companies to start picking up on for their commercials to really push.
Yes.
So, but yeah.
Yeah, it even ends as well where 15 infantry paratroop into the propylene new scene. Hell's where they want to be. Infest the rat's nest. So it ends on the album title. But again, Genius annotating the fact they mentioned 15 infantry paratroop, which is a reference to the fact that this is their 15th album, which is a quite nice meta.
There we go.
Nice little meta nod that I think of.
Well, it's a really, like, thinking about it from like a movie perspective, like, it's a really great visual to end the album on, because you imagine like all these, you know, the army of the dead, you know, raiding Mars, and, you know, they're coming up and all these rich people in their nice mansions on Mars being raided by the army of the dead. You know, it's such a great like way to end a movie, just to kind of see that. Like, I think about what's I'm blanking on the movie, the Spartan 300. That's how that movie ends, is where they're coming to avenge all the 300 Spartans that were killed. You know, that it's kind of like that ending of the movie. That's such a great way to imagine that finale to it.
Yeah, it's like a nice fun of visual, and linking it back to the album title. There is anyone listening who listens to fellow We Made This podcast, the X-Cast, so the episode of which follows the X-Files. There's an episode called This Is Not Happening from season 8, and it ends with Gillian Anderson. Gillian Anderson screaming, "This is not happening! This is not happening!" And I made the joke that every X-Files episode should end with the name of the episode. And the name of the episode for some kind of like wedged in, like for example, X-Cops. They're X-Cops. Something stupid, something silly like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, they should do. But yeah, they should do that with most albums as well. Just like somehow force the name of the album into the final line of the song. So in terms of the reception of the album, it's got generally positive stuff. So it's got a Metascore of 77 and a user score of 8.7. All the user reviews on Metacritic are positive. A lot between 10 and 8. There's a 7. Richie Passano in 2019 said, "There is not much to say, just an amazing in-your-face album. Oh, in capital letters. 8 to 10. But Big Rig gave it 10. Not usually a fan of this kind of music, but bleep me, this thing goes hard. I'll give it 11 if I could." Yeah, so it's the kind of stuff like that kind of elements. In terms of the critic reviews, the majority of them are positive. There's only one mixed. All Music gave it 8 out of 10. King Gizzard aren't sugarcoating anything, either musically or thematically, and that makes for the most timely and political album yet. It's also one of their most music compelling and impressive too, and that's saying a lot. The Enemy is the one that gave it the mixed review. So it's got a Metacritic score of 60. Things do pick up with messy closing tracks, Self-Immolate and Hell, but these are proficient rather than remarkable moments. Ultimately, it's not enough to prevent Infest the Rat's Nest from feeling like a case of look at what we can do, rather than a record fully realised, which don't fully agree with that.
Yeah.
Because I think I can get their point. I get their point in that. And get their point in what they're saying. So they're saying that what we was talking about earlier, saying like, "Oh, we've released a thrash metal album. This is what it's like." But I don't think it's not fully realised, considering about all the kind of like story nature, the nature of the story and the narrative in it.
And that goes back to the point I made earlier about like, if you are a King Gizzard fan, you will have significantly more appreciation for an album like this. It won't be, and I mean, I guess that's an argument for the critics' sake as well, that like most albums should be accessible without being a fan of the band. You should be able just to enter them. But to be a fan of the band, you're going to have a significantly more appreciation for this album just outright anyway. Like there's just no way you can.
Yeah, and Pitchfork review gave it a 6.7, which is probably a low-high score for them.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think their closing statements. Their closing statements for the review is, as the Gizzards 2 releases this year respectively prove, they're not afraid to push their sound to its most playful and punishing extremes, but it's always been more thrilling to hear them excavate the uncharted territory in between, which is Pitchfork for they like their previous albums, I think.
Yeah, just contrarians.
I need a Pitchfork translator sometimes. But yeah, I think it's still generally positive review that you're going to get from Pitchfork. But yeah, so in Australia, it got to number 2 in the Australian albums. They got to number 2, whereas in the US independents and the alternatives, it got to about 3 and 5. Independent albums in the UK got to 7. It got to 64 in the US Billboard 200, 51 in the Canadian albums, 35 in Scotland. So it performed best in Australia,
which makes sense.
Is this one of the more successful albums of theirs, or have they got?
That's a good question. I'm not too sure. I don't keep up with that too terribly much. I would think, I just know from, and this is anecdotal in my perspective, but this was the one that I saw the most buzz about in music communities, different blogs, like websites and things like that, music circles. This is the one that I saw the most chatter about. Since then I've become a little more hyper aware of them, and I'm looking for people talking about them. So I'm not going to have too much of an unbiased opinion from that. But I mean, I think this kind of piqued some of their popularity in a sense that they had really built, some fandom around like albums like I'm in Your Mind Fuzz, Nonagon Infinity, Pollywogland, however you say it. Those albums are typically considered their best, and I think a lot of fandom peaked. And then this one was just kind of like the one that rocked the boat so much that it generated so much buzz. But even like hearing that was 64 or whatever in the top 200 of Billboard for America. Like that's bananas to me. I mean, it's a metal album. Like it's a metal album by an Australian psych rock band who's largely underground in a lot of ways. Like that's just wild to me. Like that's kind of weird and speaks to how good the album is, in my opinion.
Lance, have you ever seen King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard live?
I have had the good fortune to see them one time so far. I got to see them at Bonnaroo earlier this year, which is officially an official bootleg album as of a couple of weeks ago. So that was my first time to see them. I have tickets to see them twice in October at both 2 nights at Red Rocks, October 10th and 11th. So hopefully when this comes out, I will be standing at a King Gizzard show rocking out to one of their 3-hour marathon sets. I'm trying to figure out a way to see them in Atlanta or New Orleans on their tour as well, but not sure if that's in the cards or not, but it's definitely on my radar. Something I'm hoping for. But yeah, I've seen them once.
So and that was at a festival
Yes.
lineup. So how long did they play for?
They played for an hour 15, I believe is what it tallied out to be, which I think their shows are typically around 90 minutes long. So I didn't get too much cut out. And I know when the original schedule was released, they were only slotted for an hour. And then like a week later, it was announced that they were getting 75 minutes instead of just 60, which gave them time to play The Dripping Tap, which is their most recent single. Previously from their album Omnium Gatherum, which is a like 20-minute epic. And it's just like, it's got like it's comprised of all these different parts and all these different, it's just for a 20-minute song. It is one of the most engaging songs you'll hear. The day it came out, I listened to it about 6 times in succession because I was fascinated with just the different parts and how they connected so well. And it's a really high energy song. So when they played it live, like this 30-foot circle pit opened up and people were just going crazy and there was body parts flying everywhere. And it was just a really unforgettable experience during that song.
Oh, okay. I'm quite curious to see how on earth they would ever be able to do a set list.
Oh yeah,
that would appease the fans.
Yeah,
and cover.
And
I do not envy them.
No, and they do a lot of. They typically do several songs from Infest the Rat's Nest every night. They're pretty big crowd pleasers. And I think most of their earlier albums, probably like their first 5 to 8, they don't really touch on too terribly much. But they definitely have like they're really great in that they play different sets every night. They rotate the songs pretty often. But yeah, you're right. I don't know how they pick and choose which ones come and go, but I mean, they definitely have a lot of crowd pleasers. That's for sure.
Yeah. I mean, it's gotta be like if some people kind of like a certain sound of theirs and then they go to a show and they just end up playing a lot of the other ones. It'd be an interesting experience. I do not envy them trying to pick a certain set list.
Well, and it was either late last year that they did 5 nights at one. I think it was one venue, and each night was a different genre. Like they had a metal night, a garage band night, a jam night, all these, and I forget the other 2, or acoustic night, and something else, microtonal. And so that was really cool to like they acknowledge like we have these genres that we cater to so much, and we're going to play for one night only. We're going to play only those songs, and the next night we're going to jump into another mask that we can wear really well. So they acknowledge it at least. And, I'd like to see them do that a little more often.
Yeah, I can kind of see them to do that. I think I remember having a conversation with Leah about Taylor Swift. Taylor Swift. And I think going back to, the Frank Turner episode, Frank Turner, where he's been doing kind of like a mini festival where he does different things over the course of 4 nights. And kind of makes a mini festival out of it. I can kind of see that King is doing something very similar.
Yeah.
Where like goes, okay, we're only going to be playing songs from these albums because they sound like them. The second night we're going to be playing these albums, the thrash metal night, but we're going to have a lot of thrash metal bands supporting throughout the day. And then we're going to be doing the hip hop albums. And then we're going to have hip hop artists during the day and stuff, and I can kind of see that happening. That would probably be an interesting kind of mix, particularly if you want to kind of incorporate all sorts of different genres and different local acts or traveling acts in a kind of like a weird multi-genre
I
festival.
think you've got $1 million idea right there.
Yeah, I mean, if the band are listening to this, have your people talk to my people. My people is called Matt, and also it sounds very, very similar to me. So I'll put you in touch with him. So we have talked about other albums in their discography, but if people like the sound of Infest the Rat's Nest, where would you recommend they go to next?
If they like Infest the Rat's Nest, Murder of the Universe, it's another high concept album, really big storytelling, side A, side B again. It's probably their heaviest overall album outside of Rat's Nest. It's not near as heavy at all. Their, at the time, most recent album, Omnium Gatherum, has some of what I think is their heaviest songs, in Gaia and Predator X. Gaia is hands down their heaviest song to date. That to me, Omnium Gatherum is, in my opinion, the most accessible King Gizzard album because it explores so many different albums or genres on it. Whereas most of the albums, they tend to stick with one kind of concept, one genre. This one blends them all. It goes into different things. There's hip hop, there's psych rock, there's metal. There's lots of different stuff on there. So it's a good palette for somebody who's new to the band to kind of get a taste of everything at once. But it's also got some of the heavier songs on it. So if you like Rat's Nest, you'll probably like that one as well.
And here's the $1 million question. The song for the Hall of Fame playlist on Spotify. For anyone who's not listened to this before, I'm going to ask Lance to pick one song from this album to be immortalised forever on the Spotify Hall of Fame playlist. I can't veto it, so whatever Lance says goes. So Lance, what song are you going to pick to be added?
I'm going to go with, even though it's not my favorite on the album, I'm going to go with Mars for the Rich because I think it best personifies the album as well as the sound of King Gizzard that they are able to bring, as well as the thrash element to it. I think it's the best song that blends the two of them on the album. So I'm going with Mars for the Rich.
Okay, so so Mars for the Rich joins a section of songs which on the day of recording I can't do what I usually do because the previous episode hasn't been recorded yet. So but before then we have Sturgill Simpson song and then a Sigur Rós song and Josie and the Pussycats. So so still venturing to a very interesting kind of mix of blend of songs throughout this. But yeah, and we've coming to the end of our conversation, Lance, and I say thank you for bringing King Gizzard and Lizard Wizard to me. I can finally put a sound to their name or part of their sound to their name now. So whenever I see the bloody gig posters, because they seem to play Birmingham every so often. So if people want to find you and listen to your podcast, where can they find you?
We're available everywhere, or you can go to yesterdaysconcert.com. So yeah, we're pretty much everywhere. I'm not your traditional music podcast. I've been to more than 800 concerts since 2006. And so my podcast is essentially my stories of going to these shows, but I try not to just tell them or recount them. I try to bring them to life, kind of like Disgraceland, if anybody's familiar with that podcast. I try to turn them into these audio stories with lots of bells and whistles and sound effects and first-person narratives and things like that. So I try to retell the stories if they're funny or if they just had some large, significant meaning to me. And in between seasons, because these episodes take roughly 40 hours each to produce, I do interviews with different people. Like I did a really cool interview with an audience taper, somebody who bootlegs, for lack of better words, concerts. Kind of got his perspective on why they do it and how it's cool and everyone else should be doing it. But just things like that. Love talking about music and things related to music and, just a solid music podcast, in my opinion.
Oh, okay, so slight deviation because I was going to quickly ask about this. So how many live gigs did you say you've been? Can you roughly been to?
I can remember, and I have counted like 815. I think is where I'm sitting at today. I know there's more. It's probably closer to 850 or 875 because I know there's probably ones that I've completely forgotten about and things like that. And some before I even considered going to concerts, if my parents took me or something. But yeah, I'm sitting roughly at 815 since 2006.
Oh, nice. I think I'm on to about 400, and I cracked 400 this year.
Good for you.
But I yeah, but I never really started going to gigs until I was like early 20s. So I missed out all the teenage,
Yeah.
all the teenage stuff. But no, I think I think some people, I know some people who are like, are probably similar to yourselves, who seem to like crack 100 or so in a year, and I'm like, man, I'd love to do that.
Yeah,
But,
it's fun. It's fun. It's
yeah.
time consuming. It's a little expensive sometimes, but yeah, I mean, if you can afford it in terms of time and resources, and by all means, go see the artists you love. Go support them. Go see local bands. You know, go hang out when a touring band comes to town. You know, you'll enjoy it and they'll appreciate it. So definitely do it.
Yeah, I mean, who do you think who's your most seen artist?
It's a band called.
No,
Go ahead.
I'm not talking about headline sets. I mean like sets in general. So like, if you,
So it's a band called Moon Taxi. My first time to see them was in July 2008. They're from Nashville, Tennessee. They started off pretty much a jam band, and they've kind of progressed more into like a indie pop kind of band. They were actually, if I'm thinking correctly, they were the last band that I've seen, which was like a week ago. And that was my 32nd time to see them. So for a while I was on a first name basis. They were really like the first time I saw them, there was like 15 people there. It was in a pizzeria in the middle of nowhere, Mississippi. But yeah, I've seen them go from that little tiny corner of the room to, I mean, last weekend there was probably 3,000 people out there, give or take. So I've really got to see them grow and blow up and become a great big band, and just really proud of them. Really great. Grateful I got to see them in those early days, and still enjoy getting to see them when I can.
oh, nice,
Yeah.
nice. I quite like when that happens, where like you can see a band move up and like, you're just standing there going, I remember when I could stand in front of them and watch them. No,
Well, the first time I really understood how big they were starting to hit it, I was in San Francisco for a conference, and I was standing in the hotel lobby waiting for my card to get into my room, and I heard them playing over the speakers, and I was like, what the heck? Like, I'm all the way, like, I'm thousands of miles from home, and I get to hear like this band that I love and used to see in like small little bars in town and stuff like that. Like, that was the moment for me, and that was probably like 2012, 13. Like, that was a really big moment for me to be so far and to hear them like that. That was really cool.
Yeah, and in terms of yesterday's podcast, I've not listened to all of them yet. I've listened to a couple so far.
Well, thank you.
They're on me kind of my podcast queue at the moment, and I do quite like kind of like the storytelling aspect to it.
Thank you.
Kind of adds a narrative to an experience and stuff, and quite a lot of people do kind of link, or they don't realise they have narratives for every time they go to a gig or any live music event. There's always kind of like either backstory, or there's always like the journey there, or just something that happens, or it's just the journey and stuff. And I quite like the fact that you kind of able to kind of present that in a kind of entertaining and informative way as well.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That's really, and I think that's what I really want people to identify with in my show, is that like, it's not about just the concert. Like, it's about the moments leading up to the concert. It's about the first time you heard the album live. It's about, you know, traveling to the show and the memories you make with your friends and people that you're with and things like that. Like, the concert is just like kind of the pinnacle of your existence with the music and the band and the art that you treasure so much. And that's what I want people to connect with, even if it's not the artist or the same experience. I want people to be able to say, like, I understand what he's getting at, and I've had that experience, and just to invoke a little bit of nostalgia in people as well. So, yeah,
it's this kind of very similar methodology to kind of what I like to do here, where like I try and get into the personal kind of history and relationship with the music and the band themselves in relation to the guest at the time.
Yeah.
So, and there's always kind of like a story or a meaning to them and stuff. And it's probably one of the reasons I really quite like yesterday's concert. It's got a very similar kind of like mission statement in terms of what you want to get in terms of a relationship with music, because there's a lot of crossover with kind of my mission statement with Pick a Disc. And so anyone who's listening who kind of a fan of this, I'll be guaranteed you'll find a couple of episodes of yesterday's concert you'll click with. So, yeah, definitely try that. So, yeah, that's it. We've reached the end of our conversation, Lance, and it's been great to, as I said earlier, it's great to finally get to listen to King Gizzard, and it's been an amazing experience. So,
well, dude, I'm so grateful you had me on. Like, I got to give a shout out. Like, you do a great job with what you do, and like you were saying, like you're really excellent in invoking that for people, and I hope other people are able to connect with that. Like, I'm really grateful I got to talk about this band and art album that I really love and treasure. And so I'm just really grateful to be here, man. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to Pick a Disc, and I've been your host, Matthew Latham. Our theme music is Pump by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com. Pick a Disc is hosted by the We Made This podcast network, and you can find them on www.spreaker.com/user/WeMadeThis. You can find the Pick a Disc show site on www.spreaker.com/show/pickadisc. You can find us on all the usual social media type places like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter under Pick a Disc. You can also email us on pickadisc@gmail.com. Until next time, happy listening to all those discs that you are picking. Goodbye.
Hello everyone, this is Tony Black, co-host and producer of You Have Been Watching, a podcast all about British sitcoms. Myself and co-host Robert Turnbull take you on a range of Britcom subjects and shows in our discussions, including greats such as Fawlty Towers.
Basil, in the same way as David Brent and Alan Partridge and Victor Meldrew, Basil works best when he is actually dealing with arseholes.
Lesser known curios such as 15 Stories High.
There are all these kind of like gag setups being put in place in that episode, and then the sort of the end like minute or so is basically the payoff to all of these gags, and it's very, very sitcom-y.
And even top 10s such as sitcom theme tunes. If we have to put composers of theme tunes in context for British sitcoms, I think Ronnie Hazelhurst, he's possibly the John Williams of...
I was just going to say, he is the John Williams of
I think he is.
British sitcom.
We're available on all podcast platforms and on social media at YHB Watching Pod on Twitter and Facebook, so please subscribe, get in touch, and come and have a laugh with us.